So the new Russian demands to end the war in Ukraine are crazy. Like, they're so unrealistic, it makes you wonder why they brought them up at all. They're essentially telling the world that they're ready to burn it all down just to come out on top, which is concerning, like in more ways than one. Like, best case scenario is still a bit of a problem for everyone. So I thought we'd get into what came out of these peace talks today, because maybe it gives us an idea of what Russia's strategy is going forward. Now, to do this, I think it's worth looking at a map, because a big portion of this, the craziest part that to me means that this was just an unrealistic ask start to finish, has to do with territorial control. And we'll get into that here in a second using deep state map. But there were some positives. It sounded like Ukraine went into these peace talks. They offered an immediate ceasefire with Russia, which was rejected. They offered an all-for-all prisoner exchange, which does not appear to have made any progress, and to hold a face-to-face meeting between Ukrainian President Zelensky and Russian President Vladimir Putin. That also does not seem like it's actually going to happen. I would be shocked if Putin ever agrees to meet with Zelensky. I feel like he has set the stage to where he's never going to do that. Zelensky has said he's willing to meet with Putin. I don't think Putin will ever meet with Zelensky. I think he's kind of written that off as below him or illegitimate, but we're getting sidetracked. So nonetheless, what did come out of this is it looks like a 1,000 for 1,000 prisoner of war exchange. That's positive. We're going to see a lot of people returned home that have been in captivity for a long time. Now, as a little background on this round of peace talks, about a week ago, Russian President Putin held this late night news conference where he said, hey, I propose direct talks with Ukraine. Let's do, Russia and Ukraine, talk face-to-face. Let's do it in Turkey. I propose it on the 15th and 16th. And Zelensky responded and said, great, I'll be there. Putin, you coming? And, over the course of the next couple of days, we eventually learned that no, Putin would not be going. Again, hold me to that. I don't think the two will ever meet face-to-face. I don't think Putin wants to do that. Then we heard that President Trump would not be attending because if Putin's not going to be there, Trump said he doesn't need to be there. There's nothing for him to do. And then eventually Zelensky said, fine, we'll just leave it up to the negotiators. And Zelensky went about a separate meeting with President Erdogan in Turkey. Now, to give you an idea of the ask here, I've got this deep state map up. Russia said, this is according to a couple different reports from Russia and Ukraine, the Russians demanded that Ukraine completely withdraw from the these four regions here in the eastern portion of the country, to which they received a refusal from the Ukrainian delegation. In response to this, the Russians stood up and said, next time there will be 5 regions. As in, you don't accept this one, we're just going to take more territory down the road. And there's actually a debate even if they said 5, 6, 7, or 8. Like, next time we agree to meet with you guys to actually talk about into this war, we're going to be debating the 8 territories that we hold, which is wild. And a part of that is like, with what army, genuinely, right? I wouldn't get so far into those specifics. The bigger takeaway for me on this point is they're ready to keep going. They went into these peace talks with threats of planning to continue the fight, which, if you've been following the war, has kind of been Putin's stance from the get-go. They continually shift the goalposts, not really showing any desire to actually want to end this war. The reason that this ask is so absurd, we'll get into here in a moment. There's no historical example here, and the map helps show that. So Russia's ask is that they want all of this territory that they have not yet taken. So starting down here in the south, we've got the pink is territory taken by Russia in 2014. The orange is territory taken by Russia since 2022. The green and the white is territory held by Ukraine, in the western portion here at least. So what Russia just asked is they have illegally annexed and said that Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Luhansk are all portions of the Russian Federation now. Now, in Luhansk, they hold the vast majority of that territory, right? You can see the line moving. I think there's like a small sliver in here they don't actually control, but it's something like 99% of Luhansk they actually control. So if you were to say, hey, right now, draw the line of control at the line of contact, and we'll call those new international borders, whatever it might be, Russia would end up with control of Luhansk. They're saying, not enough. We want all of this other territory that we haven't yet taken. Ukraine needs to withdraw their military from there. So all of the fortifications that have held in some of these places for years, give those up and just retreat further back into Ukraine. We don't have any case throughout history where a negotiation has played out like this. Like, we don't have an example. All right, I'm going to try to run through a couple here to try to paint the picture of how absurd this is. But as a bit of context, the territory that Russia is asking for, by saying, we will end the war, just give us all that land, is 30,000 square kilometers. Okay, so looking at this territory here in Donetsk, then in Zaporozhye, and then in Kherson, 30,000 square kilometers. Russia so far in the last 12 months, so going back to May of 2024, has taken by force 6,000 square kilometers. So they're asking for Ukraine to voluntarily give up 5 times more territory than Russia has been able to take in the last 12 months alone. And in fact, really since the opening months of the war, the territorial progress has really died down. So to find the last time, or it's taken about since March of 2022 for Russia to move 30,000 square kilometers. So that's their ask. Now, if you were to ask people in Ukraine right now about the ceasefire, there's kind of split decisions on drawing a ceasefire line along the line of contact as is, and maybe ceding some of this territory to Russia. I'm not even sure they're asking the people, what do you feel about giving up a bunch of territory that Russia has never occupied? They've never made it to. I'm not even sure that makes it into the polling questions. It's that far out of the rational view. Again, we don't have anything in history to point to where this actually makes sense. Imagine, and we'll see, maybe these connect, maybe these don't. Let's start with an example from this war. What if Ukraine said, hey, Russia, we'll agree to a ceasefire, but we want all of this territory back that you took since 2022? You'll notice Ukraine isn't even saying that anymore. Their big talk for quite a while now, has been security guarantees. So if Ukraine were to ask that, I would say legally and morally they have a right to ask that, but people would rightfully say, hey, Ukraine tried to do that. Remember the summer offensive? They were not able to push Russia out. So why would Russia all of a sudden just give that up? It would sound like an unserious ask, would it not? We wouldn't take that very seriously. And the same is true when Russia asks that of Ukraine. To give you another example here, we'll go to the historical one, and I've got a couple World War II examples today that we'll get to. Think about in World War II when Nazi Germany was storming across the Soviet Union and they got stopped at Stalingrad. What if Hitler then went to Stalin and said, hey, let's end this war, truce, ceasefire, let's call it off. Just give us the rest of the Soviet Union. Stalin would think he was crazier than he actually was, right? Like, in what world will we cede territory that you've not been able to take? That doesn't make sense. And again, we don't have any good historical references for when and how that ever would have actually played out. Now, shifting into, I do want to talk about the 3 scenarios that might actually be in Russia's plans going forward. But before diving into that, a quick promo for, selfless plug here, or shameless plug for the podcast, Unclassified Podcast that I run with Ben Wheeler each week. We'll put the link in the description below. It's on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple. Today, we were talking about Trump's tour through the Middle East, as well as the rise of Jolani, or al-Shara, from like 20 years to the date, arrested by U.S. forces in Iraq, and then shook the hand of President Trump in the Middle East. Pretty wild. Like May 14th, 05 to May 14th, 2025. It's quite the arc of return. But nonetheless, all of that, if interested, weekly podcast in the description below. So shifting over to kind of some ideas of what this might tell us about Russian strategy going forward, I do want to start with what I would say are the 2 least likely, hopefully, but worst case scenarios here. One is some sort of delusion, like Putin does not understand the current situation at the front. And I understand this is one that gets a lot of clicks and a lot of attention, and I don't know that we have a lot of evidence to point to this, but you have to keep this in mind. And again, the example that we draw regularly is Hitler in his bunker in Berlin at the final stages of World War II, commanding on paper what he thinks are divisions defending the city, and his generals just didn't have the heart to tell him, like, they're gone. They've all been killed, captured, surrendered. Like, you are moving things around on paper that do not exist. We have to keep in the back of our mind that might be a possibility, that Putin might be getting such poor information that he does not understand at all the nature of how this war is playing out. The next kind of worst case scenario in all of this is the exact opposite, that we don't know something. I think we do a pretty good job, all of us, trying to stay up to date with what's actually happening in this conflict, but I'm not going to be so naive as to say we absolutely, without a doubt, know more than Vladimir Putin does about the current state of this conflict. There's it's incorrectly applied to Mark Twain, but a quote that showed up at the beginning of the movie The Big Short, and I think it fits perfectly here, where they say, it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble, it's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And that's always something I have in the back of my mind is, what am I confident about, so confident that it's a blind spot, if you will. And I think that's something we have to keep in mind when looking at this or any other conflict. Again, those are two kind of worst case scenarios because it's a complete jump ball at that point. Moving into what I think is the most likely takeaway from Russia's position in these ceasefire talks is they are simply wanting to show the West, not just Ukraine. These talks were not about Ukraine. It was about signaling to the United States and Europe that they are ready to continue fighting for the long haul. This is more important to Russia than it is to any of us, save Ukraine. And that was personified by the head of the delegation here, Vladimir Medinsky, had a couple quotes where he said, quote, "We don't want war, but we are ready to fight for a year, 2, 3, however long it takes. We fought with Sweden for 21 years. How long are you ready to fight?" Maybe some of those sitting here at the table will lose more of their loved ones. Russia is prepared to fight forever. And again, going back to the initial statement, the signal that Russia is giving is not, I think we're going to end up losing some time and energy trying to figure out like where are these Russian divisions and corps that could possibly take more Ukrainian territory in the next couple months or years. I think that's a waste of energy because I don't think that's the big takeaway. The big takeaway is Russia's just ready to go for the long haul. Whether they can or can't is a different story, but they're committed to continuing this fight. And I think personally that is a message to the United States and to the populations of the United States and Ukraine's European allies. There's been a lot of debate in a lot of countries, even the staunchest allies of Ukraine, about how long can this go on? And speaking from a U.S. perspective, we saw this very early on in the war. I think it was poor messaging by the United States to make it seem like this thing would be over pretty quickly. And before long, you had people saying, "Really? How long are we going to do this? How many times have you heard the term forever war?" We're not even in Ukraine. We're not even fighting this war, and it's being presented as a forever war that we have been drug into. If somebody had to stand in front of the U.S. population right now and say, hey, we are getting ready to fund this fight or provide intelligence or maybe risk the possibility of nuclear war for the next 5, 10, 20 years, it wouldn't go over. We don't have that interest in Ukraine, in Russia, in Europe. And I would argue that most European countries, the general population, does not either. There's other things that would take a priority. There's very few people, I think, that would sign on to 20 years of conflict, even if it is just supporting with weapons and intelligence and risking the possibility of a broader escalation. Nobody wants to sign up for that outside of the Ukrainian people that want to maintain their autonomy. So I think that this was a message sent to the United States and the Europeans. And at its core, what this tells me is Putin expects that he's going to be able to get something better in the future than he can get right now. And I think a lot of people over the last few months especially would have pointed to Trump and say, well, Trump will get into office and Putin knows this and he wants Trump to win or whatever it might be so he can get a good deal. I don't think that's the right angle either. I think what he's looking at, and I think he's correctly assessing this, is that Trump does not want us to get involved militarily anywhere at all. I mean, we've seen in recent conflicts and negotiations, what is he always talking about? Trade, the economy, right? Number one issue right now is the United States economy and the tariffs. That's not anything new. But when he's talking about this ceasefire between Pakistan and India, what did he bring up? Trade, incentivizing trade with the United States and each of those. Just yesterday, talking about Iran, what did he bring up? Trade, pulling them into the international economy, finding a way to bolster their economy so they can win in the long term. I just get the feeling that that is more important than risking anything in a conflict. And we're seeing the similar situation with the Houthis down in Yemen. We walked away from that. I would argue that we did not necessarily accomplish our objectives, but Trump very much didn't want to get drug into a longer and longer conflict. Putin probably sees all this and says, hey, Trump is not going to cross the line, does not want this war to continue, is definitely not going to join the conflict. So let's just make sure he knows that we're ready to do this for the next 10, 20, 30 years. And I think what we've seen so far from Russia, Ukraine, Europe, and the United States is Putin is making the correct calculation there. I mean, so far, the only two parties that we have seen that are confident day in and day out and actually backing up their words consistently is Putin and Zelensky. I don't like the way that Putin is doing it, but we have to agree he's been consistent in his messaging, all things considered, and his actions have backed up his words. I wish they didn't, because I don't like what he's doing, but the same is said of Zelensky. Zelensky is backing up his actions, is backing up his words with his actions by continuing to stay in the fight and to fight for his country. Europe has done a much better job in recent years in recent months of talking the talk, but they're still not really walking the walk. Like, do you remember, this is a long time ago, but do you remember at the start of this week, there was supposed to be a ceasefire in place? We had the UK, Germany, Poland, France say, hey, ceasefire or else. Has to be in place Monday. Well, Monday came and, no ceasefire. And then they said, well, Monday night or else. It's 4 days ago. All right? Like, nothing has changed. The sanctions have not increased. They're not new weapons flowing into Ukraine. That red line was thrown down. Putin watched as it just evaporated and it went away. So, look, I think Europe is heading in the right direction, but when it comes to this conflict, they're still in the phase of talking a big game and not necessarily backing it up. The United States, we're not necessarily a lot better. I think under the Biden administration, we had our head in the right place. We had the right idea. I think the execution was pretty bad, start to finish. To not get too far into the details, I think it was a slow drip of supplies that was unwarranted. I think we unnecessarily hampered Ukraine's ability to strike Russian targets with certain munitions at certain locations that really degraded their ability to effectively fight. And I think we tried to force Ukraine into fighting a type of war that we would fight with air power, especially during their summer offensive, that cost them a lot of manpower and equipment. I think the execution under the Biden administration was very, very poor when looking at Ukraine. The Trump administration, I'm not even sure that we have a plan when it comes to Ukraine, to be totally honest. And the execution kind of matches that. It's a little bit all over the place. So it has not been good, but I also have a hard time dialing in exactly what we're trying to do. So when you look at all of that and kind of step back, I get it. Putin's making a calculation here that I don't think is wildly far off. If he could, he would like to take Ukraine on one-on-one. And over the long term, they probably will come out on top. Russia has a lot of advantages, especially if all of Ukraine's Western allies back out. So Putin is doing what any rational actor in his spot would try to do, right? Separate the alliance, break apart the alliance, get the UK, get the United States, Germany, France, Poland, one by one, peel them off. Less and less support for Ukraine increases the likelihood of a Russian victory, probably not in the short term, but over the long term, which does raise the stipulation here that I feel like we have to bring up. There is the possibility that Putin's in a bad spot, and he views this as his only way out. I don't want to present all of this as the idea that Russia is clearly winning and they're so far out in front that they're able to dictate the terms. There's a good chance that Putin's kind of backed into a corner right now, and the only way he can see out of this is to kind of double down and threaten to continue this fighting indefinitely, which that's not good, right? If the only way he sees out of this conflict is continued war, that's a problem. Not just for the Russian soldiers, they're going to be fed into the meat grinder, but for anyone involved, because it makes you wonder, how far will he go? If fighting is the only option, will he escalate by striking new targets or using new munitions? So anyways, based off of what we've seen today from the Russian position, it looks to me like they're just trying to solidify in our minds, the United States and the West, that they're going to be doing this for a long time, trying to show us how much more important this fight is to them than it is to us. And they're probably not wrong. We'll have to wait and see how the U.S. and Ukraine's allies respond to essentially this pushback of Russia saying we're not even close to discussing peace. But that's all I got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.